business. Let's give a big welcome to Ms. Jeanne DiFrancisco.
What I'm going to talk with you about is really about understanding what we do in education in a very different way. And we're going to start with talking a little bit about what it means to be human capital and what it really means to be an asset. And I think very many times when we're talking about human capital in an organization, and most of my work is with companies, and most of the time we think about it like a job. And there's been a lot of discussion in in the last few years about the issue of jobs, what's happening to them, what's the future of them. So I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about human capital and really a very different way to think about it than you may have historically. So if you think about really what makes a capability, whether it's for a company or a city, it really takes three kinds of assets working together. And as you can see, human capital, physical capital, and technology all have to be combined to create a capability like public safety or law enforcement. And the reason it's so important to understand human capital in that context is it's because these assets, in fact, are working together that they are able to actually create a result for a city or for a company. So even though it does take all of those assets to make a capability, by far and away the most important asset is human capital. And people really change very much what is actually can happen in a company. And it is generally the asset that is the least understood for managers in companies. They can tell you every bolt down to the very last one, I assure you, in an automotive plant. But they oftentimes can't tell you a lot about the skills and the talent and the capabilities of the people in that plant. And it's a very common problem. So what we spend a lot of time thinking about is really how to understand human productivity and human performance. And really productivity is the idea of the relationship between what you put into something and what you get out of it. So I thought I'd give you a little background on productivity. What you'll see here, and I hope you can see these slides, but I'll kind of describe basically what's been going on in the history over the last maybe 40, 50 years is that productivity and employment pretty much were tracking until about the year 2000. In the last decade and a half or so, we've been able to improve our productivity in our country without increasing employment. Does everybody see that? Can you kind of see how that works? Okay. So you can also see that the productivity of the country is accelerating, but notice that wages are also not accelerating. And that trend has been going on almost really since like the early 80s. Now, this is a very big shift. And it is something that I think most of us like kind of experience and feel, but I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about why this is actually happening. Now we can go to our next slide. Okay. So basically we have a major economic shift going on. And I know in Detroit it feels like the shift is only happening here, but it's actually happening everywhere. And this is a once-in-a-100-year shift that is occurring at this time. The best way to think about these shifts is to think about them, and the way to kind of understand what's happening in the economy is to look at the concentration of wealth curves over time. This is really what's happening in the concentration of wealth for the top 1%, and this is what's happening to the average wages for everyone else. So you might say, why is this interesting? This part of this curve is the part of the curve that we historically think of as the Gilded Age. This was a time when our economy was fundamentally shifting from an agriculture and a very small family-owned business economy to the industrial economy we know today. This part of the curve is where you had Rockefeller and Carnegie and J.P. Morgan. This is the part of the curve where they amassed fantastic amounts of wealth, really by organizing the economy we know today. It was the rise of the modern corporation and really the rise of the modern job. Now, what's been happening since that time, what you'll see here is a very important shift happened in that time frame. And one of them was that Henry Ford, in that time frame, determined that a 40-hour week and a living wage was absolutely essential, not only because he thought it made people more productive, but he also knew that they could then buy his cars. The modern consumer economy and the living wage very much can be attributed to people like Henry Ford. And this is what you see here in terms of the rise of the average wage, which rose very, very steadily until about the mid to late 70s. So what we are seeing now is a very, very different phenomenon that is occurring, because this process stopped and the concentration of wealth has now continued on. So now we are almost at the same levels that we were back in the Gilded Age. And so you might say, why is she telling me this? And that is because the fundamental nature of work is shifting, just like it did 100 years ago. So now our next slide. So what you see is work in the 21st century is very, very different. And the reason that you see those curves diverge is because automation and computerization and information technologies have made people very much more productive. So things like machines that lay brick, you might have never been able to imagine. Now you can just put bricks in the top and a brick sidewalk comes out the back end. Of course, robotics in auto manufacturing, these things have been going on for a long time. So the question is, what is the work of the 21st century really going to be like? And it's going to be about the people who design the programs, who write the code, who build the robots. That's the next generation of work that has to occur. And fortunately, you have at T.LAB an education environment that is so much better preparing kids for that world that they're going to live in. It's pretty, our next slide. What is pretty clear overall is that in almost every category, the United States is falling off in terms of its scores in reading, science, and math. We are pretty much falling consistently. We have been falling consistently for about the last 20 years. And this is really a question of why is that happening? We spend more money on education than any other country in the world, and you might ask the question, how could we possibly be losing this much ground in our education performance? And the answer is because our economy changed and our schools have not. So, next slide. What you'll see in most American schools is that they've not fundamentally changed. The school that you typically see is not fundamentally changed in the last 50 years. This is pretty much a post-World War II construct, and it did a very good job producing an industrial workforce for a very long time. But that is not the work of the future. A T.LAB is much more like the classroom of the future. It's much more like the way kids need to learn in the future. And if I've learned nothing in my short time here, I have learned that the students that are produced by T.LAB are truly remarkable and very much better prepared for the work that's going to come in the future. So I'd really like to take this opportunity to help everyone understand that preparing kids for the 21st century and preparing them to be globally competitive and engaged citizens is the most important thing that the United States has to do. And it takes every one of you parents and a bit of all of our collective effort to steward that process. We in our company, we also have an initiative that we're working on to really transform urban education and prepare kids for a 21st century, to really be globally competitive in the 21st century. One of the reasons we are working with T.LAB is because we think this is the kind of model that will become not the after-school program, this will become school in the 21st century. It has to look much more like this. So, I will leave you with a little message for Detroit. I know it's no secret that Detroit is facing some very difficult challenges, and there is no question that I know it sometimes feels like Detroit is a remnant of the past, and actually I think it's much more likely to be a bellwether of the future. I think a lot of cities are going to be in the same position that Detroit is in, and so in this way you are, just as you did when in the change in the 20th century, you'll be the bellwether that will lead us through the 21st century. It is not, you are not at all in the past here in Detroit. I mean, seriously, you should congratulate yourself. So I think the only question is, where will you take us? Because at the turn of the century, you brought us unprecedented wealth, comfort, convenience. I mean, this is what the modern age has done. And now I think it's just a question of what will you do next? Detroit has so many assets. It's history, it's music. I know it feels oftentimes like all this abandoned buildings and property is really like a terrible thing, but it's not. It just is. These are assets. And it's just like human capital. It's just like things like your Motown brand. You have to learn how to leverage those into the 21st century. And the real question is, will you do that? Will you really understand that of all the assets you have, the people of Detroit are your most important assets? Making investments in them, understanding the value in them, that is what will really help you to not only lead Detroit into the 21st century, but I have a feeling you'll be leading the rest of us as well. Thank you very much.